Users navigate Android apps through a combination of buttons, menus, and action bar items. I'm going to describe how to define a menu in an XML file, and then how to react when the user selects a menu item by using an attribute in a layout file. I'm working in the project Options menu, and I'm continuing from the previous project where I had created a couple of buttons in an activity layout. When the user clicks these buttons, the app takes certain actions, in this case, changing from one image to another. When you create a brand new project, in your Resources folder, you'll find a Menu folder, and in there you'll find an XML file that's typically named menu_main. This usually has a single item, labeled Settings, and this XML file is one part of the puzzle in how we define menus. When I run the app, I see an Options icon in the top right corner. The position of the Options icon can change from one version of Android to the next, but defining the menu will always create that icon. Right now, when I choose the item from the Settings menu, nothing is happening, and that's as expected. Let's track through the steps of how the menu is read and then added to the app. I'll go to the main activity class. As the activity is created in memory, the framework calls the method onCreateOptionsMenu. If you haven't defined this method yourself, then the superclasses version will be executed, but it doesn't do anything. Here's what's going on in this version. I'm calling a set of methods, getMenuInflator.inflate, and I'm passing in the resource ID of the menu resource. In this case, it's that XML file, menu_main, and I can control or command click to jump back to it from the Java class. When onCreateOptionsMenu is called, a menu object is passed in by the framework, and then this code passes that object onward. And so it's saying, go get the menu definition and add it to this menu object. And then there's a return statement, always returning true. So the framework is opening the XML file with the inflate method call, and then adding the menu contents to the options menu. If you want to add new items, all you have to do is define them here. I'm going to reformat the code, and then I'll copy and paste this menu item. Each menu item needs its own unique ID. Typically, you start with action_, and then add whatever you need to identify the menu item. I'll set this as display resource. The order and category attribute controls the ordering of the items in the menu. You'll want to make sure you're using unique numeric values. I'll set this at 101. Next, you need a string that will be the title of the menu. I'm going to use an existing string, image resource. And this is the same string that I was using to display on the face of the button before. And for the moment, I'm going to remove the show as action attribute. We'll come back to that later. So now, I'll save and run the app again. And when the app appears on the device, I'll choose the Options menu, and I'll see that my new menu item is appearing. So far, so good. Now I need to add code that'll execute when the menu item is selected. The Settings menu item is currently being handled in pure code. When the user selects an item from the menu or from the action bar, that calls the method onOptionsItemSelected. The code at line 38 is getting the item ID. That's the resource ID of the menu item. And then there's some conditional code here that's looking for the right item. Now, you can handle all your menu items in a single complex if and if-else statement or in a switch statement. But another approach is to create unique event handler methods for each menu item. And that's what I'll do. I'll go back to my menu resource file. And then I'll add an onClick attribute. This is just like working with a button in an XML layout file. I'll set the name of the method that I'd like to call. I'll call this Action Resource Click Handler. And then I'll use an intention action or quick fix, and I'll create that method in my Java class. Then I'll take this code that's currently in the button component, and I'll copy it, and I'll paste it down here to my new method. Then I'm going to get rid of this code here. Eventually, I'm going to delete these buttons from the layout file. I'll save the change, and I'll run the app again. When the app appears, I'll click the original button, and it no longer displays the new image. But now I'll go to my Options menu and choose Change to Resource, and the image changes. Now let's follow the same pattern for the other bit of code. I'll go back to the menu. I'll once again create a new item. I'll change the action ID for this one to Image Display Asset. I'll change Order and Category to 102. And I'll change the string that this item displays to Image Asset. I'll change the name of the method that I want to call to Action Asset Click Handler, and then use an intention action to create the new method. I'll then go get the code I need and cut and paste it. And now I'm done with these two methods, the btn onClick handler and btn2Click handler. I'm just going to delete those. Then I'll go back to the activity main.xml. I'll look in text view, and I'm going to delete those two buttons that I had previously created. So now everything is being handled through the onClick attributes in the menu resource file. In the main activity class, those attributes are triggering calls to these two methods. Notice that when these methods are called, they're receiving references to the menu item that the user selected. I'll clean up this code a little bit, removing unnecessary white space, and then I'll run the app again. Now the buttons are gone from the activity layout, but the menu items appear in the Options menu, and I can choose Change to Resource, and I can switch back to Change to Asset. And you can add as many items to the menu as you like using that menu resource file, and each one of the items can call its own distinct Java method. In a previous demonstration, I showed how to build a static menu in a menu resource file, and then showed how that menu is added at runtime in the onCreateOptions menu method. This is a callback method, just like onCreate and onOptionsItemSelected. It's called by the framework, in this case, as the activity is being created. And to use a static menu, you use the getMenuInflator method and its inflate method, and you load the menu from the XML file. But you can also add items dynamically at runtime, and I'll show you how to do that in this project, Runtime Menu. You can either do this exclusively, that is, only set up your items at runtime, or you can mix static definitions and dynamic definitions. I'm going to mix the two. Right now, in this app, I'm showing 3 menu items that are defined in this XML file. Notice the order and category settings. This controls the order of the menu items. The lowest numbers start off at the top of the menu. The highest numbers are at the bottom. So now I'm going to add another menu item with a bit of Java code. I'll place the cursor after the existing code that's loading the XML file. Then I'll create a new variable typed as menu item. This is a member of Android.view. I'll name the variable item, and I'll instantiate it by calling a method of the menu object. This is the menu object that's been passed into the onCreateOptions menu method as an argument or parameter. I'll call menu.add. There are 4 versions of this method. The simplest ones take either a character sequence or a string, or an integer value, which is a string resource ID. If you use those simpler versions of the method, your menu item will show up and it'll be usable, but you have limited control over the order in which it appears in the menu. Instead, I'm going to use a more complex version of this method that accepts 4 arguments. The first argument is an integer. It's called the group ID, and it determines a grouping in a menu. Now, I'm just doing a simple flat menu, so I'm not concerned with the group ID. So I'll pass in a value of menu.none. That's a constant that only is used for menu objects. Next, I'm asked for an item ID, and this would be assigned to the menu item so I could find out which item had been selected in the onOptionsItemSelected method. But I'm not going to process this menu item that way. I'm going to use a callback method instead. So once again, I'll pass in menu.none. The third value is the order, and this does matter. Again, this will determine the position of this menu item in the menu. My previous menu items had order values from 100 to 102, so I'll assign this as 103. And the fourth argument can either be a string or a character sequence, or a string resource ID. I'm going to type in a literal string of new item. Then I'll run the app on my device, and I'll select the menu, and I see that the new item menu choice is now available. When I select it right now, nothing happens though. So now I'm going to go back to my code, and I'll add a callback method definition. I'm going to be creating an instance of a class called onMenuItemClickListener, and I'll set it in much the same way I did previously with button objects. I'll start with item.setOnMenuItemClickListener, and then I'll pass into that an instance of onMenuItemClickListener, and that's a class that's a field of the MenuItem class. I'll make sure I've added a semicolon at the end of that whole statement, and now I'm ready to add code that will be executed when the menu item is selected. That code will go here, inside the onMenuItemClick method. In order to show the user that they've selected something, I'll use a feature of the Android SDK called the Toast class. The Toast class displays messages on the screen. It works like this. You start with toast.makeText. Then you pass in the context. That's the activity that owns this message. I can't just type this. That would refer to the current instance of the ClickListener object. What I want is the current instance of the main activity class. So I'll use the expression mainActivity.this. Next, I'll pass in a string or a string resource ID. I'll use a literal string of uChosenItem. And then I need a duration. This is an integer value, and there are two commonly used values that are constants of the Toast class. They're called length long and length short. Finally, at the end of all that, I'll put in a dot character and call the show method. Now I'm going to add some hard returns here, so this is a little bit easier to read. And now I'm outputting a message to the screen telling the user that they chose a menu item. So to review the code, first I'm creating the menu item by calling the add method of the menu object. Then I'm adding the click listener. The click listener is an anonymous object that implements the onMenuItemClickListener interface. And I'll run the app again. When the app appears in the device, I'll open the menu and choose New Item, and I see the message displayed. So that's how you can add menu items dynamically at runtime using Java code. You'll need to use the MenuItem class, methods of the menu class, and you'll need to understand how to create callback method definitions to react to when the user selects the item from the menu. When you declare a menu item, either in a menu resource file or in Java code, by default, that menu item will appear on a menu that pops up when the user touches the options icon. But you can make menu items appear instead in the action bar by simply changing one declaration in the XML file or writing one additional line of code in Java. Here's how you do it in XML. I'm working in the project action bar. When this menu file was created, it had a single menu selection, Settings, and it has an attribute named ShowAsAction set to a value of never. I'm going to add that same attribute. I'll select ShowAsAction, and this time I'll set it to a value of always. Now beware, this is not quite right yet, because the ShowAsAction attribute is not a member of the same namespace as all of the other attributes in the item element. Instead, it's a member of this namespace, which has a prefix of app. So I'll double-click on the Android prefix here and set it to app. Then I'll copy and paste that attribute into the last menu item. Now, to make sure that both of these menu items will fit comfortably on the action bar, even on a smaller cell phone screen, I'll change the string resources. I'll control-click to get to the string resource file, and then I'll delete the words change to for both of those items. So now the menu items only say resource and asset, and I'll run the app. And there's the result. The menu items now appear in the action bar, and they do exactly the same thing as before. They both are calling Java-based methods that are executing when the user selects the menu item. You have a lot more control over the action bar from XML. For example, instead of saying always, you could say if room, and that would mean only show the action bar item if there's available space. I'll change this value to if room for all three of these items. And then once again, I'll run the app. And when the app appears, only two of the items are appearing on the action bar. The third, asset, is still back on the options menu. But now, if I switch the orientation by pressing CTRL F11, all three items appear in the action bar, because now I have plenty of space. I'll reset the orientation of the device to portrait and come back to the code. You can also place a menu item on the action bar that you created in Java code. In my main activity class, I'm currently creating a menu item object, and then I've added a click listener to react when the user selects the menu item. I'll add a line of code here. I'll call the method item.setShowAsAction. This takes an integer value, and there are some constants of the menu item class that you can use. I'll type menu item dot, and then here are 5 constants that are the equivalents of the strings you use in the XML files. And I'll do the same thing as I did with the XML files. I'll choose show as action if room. And now I'll run the app again. Once again, in portrait mode, I'm only seeing 2 items on the action bar, and the others are back on the menu. But now I'll switch orientation with CTRL F11 again, and now all 4 items are on the menu, and the options icon has completely disappeared because there are no items left to be represented there. I can click any of the menu items, and they'll all do exactly what they did before. The only thing that's changed is the position and display of the menu items.